Study Session 9, International Organizations, United Nations. Introduction. In this study session, we shall explore the roles of the international organizations with particular attention to the United Nations because they directly influence international politics and the quest for international peace. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study session, you should be able to evaluate the success of the United Nations since inception. An overview of the United Nations, UN. The failure of the League of Nations. Read more about the League of Nations. To prevent the outbreak of the Second World War resulted in the formation of the United Nations. It should be noted that the vast destruction, shocking death toll, and terrifying new weapons of the Second World War sparked renewed efforts to ensure world peace through the establishment of a powerful international organization. Basically, the history of the UN can be taken from the period between August and October 1944, when indeed the World War II had commenced. Thus, the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, where the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China met to devise the mode of operations of the United Nations organization. Consequent to this meeting, the United Nations Conference of International Organization specifically meant to outline and design a working model of the United Nations met at San Francisco on April the 25th, 1945. This meeting was attended by as large a number as 51 states. Hence, by the 24th of October 1944, the United Nations was born formally. The founders of the United Nations in 1945 were intent on rectifying the defects in the League's collective security system. A major effort was made to ensure that no potential member state would be excluded from the new organization. Tip: it should be noted that the vast destruction, shocking death toll, and terrifying new weapons of the Second World War sparked renewed efforts to ensure world peace through the establishment of a powerful international organization. What are the aims and objectives of the United Nations? The United Nations was established to achieve three main aims. These are: 1. To preserve international peace and security. This fundamental objective is to be realized through such measures as arms control. Hence, the setting up of international atomic and energy agencies, IAEA, to ensure that nations, especially the superpowers, complied with the maximum limit agreed by nations as regards arms acquisition. 2. To promote cooperation in economic, social, and cultural relationship within the international system. 3. To encourage mutual and cordial relations based on the principle of sovereign equality, as well as the self-determination of people amongst nations. In order to achieve the above objectives, the United Nations recognized the following principles as contained in Article 1 of its Charter. 1. Sovereign equality of all nations. 2. Peaceful resolution of international disputes. 3. Respect of the territorial integrity and political independence of other nations. 4. non-interference in the internal affairs of sovereign member nations. Like the League of Nations, the United Nations has three main political organs, that is, the General Assembly, the Secretariat, and the Security Council. The General Assembly was designed as a deliberative body in which all UN members would have an equal voice and an equal vote. More importantly, the United Nations Charter created the Security Council entrusted with primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. It stipulated that this body was to be made up of 5 permanent members, which are the United States, the Soviet Union, recently replaced by the Russian Republic, Britain, France, and China, and 10 non-permanent members. In contrast to the League, the so-called Big Five alone were given the right to veto certain specified important matters, such as the selection of the Secretary General, as well as proposed peacekeeping measures. In the UN, the most powerful countries could have responsibilities commensurate with their capabilities. United Nations during the Cold War. The UN could not escape the same problems that had destroyed the League of Nations. Individual nations were simply not ready to commit themselves to the extent that the organization's proper functioning required, nor were they willing to surrender their sovereignty. Similarly, the UN faced another problem as a result of persistent states of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. This tension seriously hampered the working of the UN during the Cold War. Because each superpower maintained a coalition of allies, followers, and admirers that at one time or another held the majority in the General Assembly, deadlock rather than decisive action became the hallmark of most UN deliberations. The consensus necessary to promote peace through collective security was also absent at many crucial junctures. If the Soviet Union did not veto a controversial measure, the United States often did. In spite of these difficulties, the limited conflict management functions of the UN were not always unsuccessful. At various times since its founding, the United Nations has contributed to peace by sending special mediators, truce supervision teams, or quasi-military forces to various parts of the world, including the Congo, Cyprus, the Middle East, and the Balkans. These efforts, though typically limited in scope and success, have proved valuable. Hint: the consensus necessary to promote peace through collective security was also absent at many critical junctures. If the Soviet Union did not veto a controversial measure, the United States often did. United Nations after the Cold War. The mid to late 1980s saw an unprecedented period of cooperation among the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, particularly between the United States and the Soviet Union. The catalyst was the Soviet Union's new conciliatory foreign policy initiated by Mikhail Gorbachev. After the collapse of the Soviet system in 1991, the United States exercised relatively uncontested influence in the United Nations. For the first time in history, the United Nations was characterized by a unity of purpose rather than sharp conflict between its most powerful members. This era of increased cooperation produced two significant results. First, the United Nations embraced a particularly vigorous approach to international peacekeeping, sometimes bordering on peacemaking. Second, it sanctioned collective military action against Iraq after it invaded Kuwait. UN and peacekeeping operations. The presence of the UN peacekeeping forces stationed over the world at the start of the new millennium testified to the enhanced role of the United Nations in the post-Cold War period. No fewer than 47,000 peacekeepers from 88 countries were serving in 15 UN operations prior to 9/11. More than 3/4 of all peacekeeping operations have been launched since the end of the Cold War, which was between 1989 and 1991, than during the entire Cold War era. In all, a total of 59 such operations were launched between 1948 and 2004. As at May 2004, no fewer than 16 UN peacekeeping operations with more than 55,000 personnel were underway in various parts of the globe. Note: for the first time in history, the United Nations was characterized by a unity of purpose rather than sharp conflict between its most powerful members. This era of increased cooperation produced two significant results. First, the UN embraced a particularly vigorous approach to international peacekeeping, sometimes bordering on peacemaking. Second, it sanctioned collective military action against Iraq after it invaded Kuwait. UN peacekeeping actions are more frequent and ambitious than ever before in the organization's history. In the first decade of the post-Cold War period, the United Nations launched peacekeeping operations in Kosovo, Yugoslavia, Sierra Leone, West Africa, East Timor, formerly part of Indonesia, the Congo, Central Africa, and the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. But these adventures were not risk-free, and they came along with no guarantee of success. For example, UN troops were sent to Somalia in 1992 to facilitate the safe distribution of food to starving people, but rebels who viewed the UN as a cat's paw for the West, that is, the United States in particular, attacked them. Collective military action. In August 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the United Nations responded by authorizing collective military action. The use of force in this instance recalled Woodrow Wilson's failed dream of collective security, wherein the League of Nations would be the vehicle for peace and order in the world. The UN response to Iraq also pointed back to a previous attempt at collective military action. In June 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea, the United Nations responded with military force. But even that instance of collective security was problematic. The Soviet Union did not participate, and in fact objected strenuously to the use of the United Nations as a legal pretext for, in Moscow's view, an American military intervention in defense of a future client state, South Korea. In 1990 to 1991, when the United States, backed by the British, launched Operation Desert Storm against Iraq, the Security Council became a forum for the major powers to meet and consult on how to respond to Iraq aggression. The United States gained the Security Council's support for resolutions condemning Iraq, establishing tough economic sanctions, and ultimately approving the use of force to expel the Iraq army from Kuwait. United Nations and the Second Gulf War. In 2002, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1441 requiring Iraq to disarm and allowing weapons inspection or face serious consequences. Though Iraq's ruler, Saddam Hussein, had evicted UN weapons inspectors in 1998, the defiant dictator had little choice but to comply when President Bush issued an ultimatum and began a massive military buildup in the Persian Gulf. Weapons inspectors visited 300 sites in December 2002 and January 2003. Chief UN Inspector Hans Blix reported to the Security Council that Iraq was not fully cooperating but recommended that the inspection continue. Although weapons inspectors had found no weapons of mass destructions or weapons laboratories, the Bush administration claimed to have evidence that the Iraq dictator in fact possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed an imminent danger to world peace. The Security Council was strongly against an immediate invasion. In opposing a rush to war, France and Germany, America's longtime NATO allies, took the lead. Russia and China, both permanent members of the Security Council, like France, also opposed military action. However, President Bush decided to act unilaterally, asserting that postponing the action would only prolong the cat-and-mouse game and plan into Saddam's hands. Most members of the Security Council, as well as several key NATO allies, remained unconvinced and adamantly opposed. But the Bush administration ignored public opinion both at home and abroad. The US thus invaded Iraq. The outcome of the invasion phase of the war was never in doubt. The US had overwhelming military superiority. Limits of international organization. Despite its successes, the United Nations has not lived up to all the expectations of its members. Although its architects sought to solve procedural problems associated with the League of Nations, such as unanimity rule that prevented the League's assembly from acting unless all its members could agree, the United Nations has had share of similar problems. Procedural difficulties, however, are often rooted in deep-seated political differences. Other problems associated with the UN include problem of inequality. Small powers typically demand formal equality with large nations in international organizations. Anything less, they contend, would undermine the world rule of law and the concept of sovereignty it enshrines. By the same logic, Big powers insist that military superiority and overall prowess must be reflected in special procedural arrangements, such as the veto power of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Anything else, they argue, would fail to recognize the actual distribution of power in the world. Moreover, as the strength of member states fluctuates, the original formula governing such matters needs to be revised. Some nations formerly considered great powers have to be demoted to make room for newcomers whose status are rising. Problem of unity. In the past, the most successful international organizations have been based on a common enemy. The Holy Alliance, inspired by the fear of a resurgent France, is a case in this point. Similarly, fear of the Soviet Union led to the creation of NATO alliance after World War II. Finally, the high point of United Nations unity came in 1990 to 1991, when most nations of the world joined the United States in opposing a common enemy, Iraq. When the original threat fades, however, the ties that bind tend to disintegrate. Problem of sovereignty. The supreme power a state exercises within its boundaries underlines all two problems previously mentioned. Finally, sovereignty is indivisible. Either a nation has the last word in its own affairs or it does not. A nation can no more be partially sovereign. Thus, the creation of an effective world government will be possible only if existing governments could be persuaded to surrender sovereignty to a higher authority, a prospect most nation-states consider too risky in a world where fear, prejudice, and mistrust continue to permeate politics. Study session summary. In this study session, we learned that international anarchy is balanced by world order, rules and institutions through which states operate for mutual benefits. States follow the rules, both moral norms and formal international laws. These rules operate through institutions, that is, international organizations, with the UN at the center of the institutional framework. The United Nations embodies a tension between state sovereignty and supranational authority. In part, because of its difference to state sovereignty, the UN has attracted universal membership of the world's states, including all the great powers. Despite the UN achievements, the organization has some problems: the problem of inequality, problem of unity, and problem of sovereignty. End of study session 9. Thanks for listening.